The winter wheat had come up then that year. Harold Miller could see it from the kitchen window every morning. The pale green fuzz across the top 40 acres. Sparse as a hair on an old man's head. The kind of stand that made a farmer's stomach tighten. Before he'd even poured his coffee, he'd say nothing about it. He'd just stand there in his union suit and wool socks, holding his cup with both hands, staring out across the frozen caliche flats, while Eileen moved behind him the stove, the bacon popping, the radio on low. He'd say nothing, but she always knew what he was thinking. 22 years of marriage teaches a woman to read a man's silence the way she reads weather. "It'll thicken," she'd say. "Maybe," he'd answer. And she knew that meant no. The panhandle of Texas in February is not a landscape that offers comfort. The sky sits low and gray, the color of old tin, and the wind comes screaming down off the Llano Estacado from the north without anything to stop it. No trees, no hills, just a flat brown earth, and the creaking windmill and the occasional hawk riding a thermal with nothing below worth the effort. Harold had been born on this land, the son of a man who'd survived the Dust Bowl by sheer stubbornness, and he wore that inheritance in the deep lines of his face and the permanent squint from 40 years of Texas sun. He was 56 years old in February of 1958. He looked older. Farming makes you old. But he moved through his days with the unhurried certainty of a man who understood exactly what he was and where he belonged. He had 160 acres in wheat and another 160 in fallow, rotating as his father had taught him. He had a good barn, a reliable Ford tractor, a windmill that only needed the brake replaced once in the last decade, and a water tank that had never gone dry even in the drought years of 52 and 53. He had a daughter named Clara, who was 20 years old and studying at the community college in Amarillo. Coming home on weekends with textbooks and opinions about the wider world that both pleased and puzzled him. He had a wife who could outwork most men in the county and who had never once complained about anything in a manner he could specifically prove. What he did not have was a cushion. The note at First National in Amarillo had been running since 1951, when he bought the back section from old Pete Dumas's estate. $9,200 at 4.5%, stretched out over 15 years. In good years, the payments came easily. In the lean years of the mid-50s, Eileen had sold preserves at the Deaf Smith County Fair, and Clara had picked cotton for the Hendersons 2 summers running, and Harold had done fence repair for ranchers to the west. And the payment had always been made, never more than a week late. It had never been easy, but it had always been made. The morning of February 14th, 1958, started like every other morning. Harold ate his eggs, drank his coffee, read the Amarillo Globe News weather page, and told Eileen he was going out to check the south fence line where a section of cedar posts had been heaving from the freeze-thaw cycle. She handed him his canvas work coat. Without being asked, he put on his hat. He kissed her on the side of the head, quickly, the way men of his generation kiss their wives. Not without love, just without theater. "I'll be back before noon," he said. He was not back before noon. Clara found him at 12:30. He was lying on his back in the dormant grass beside the fence line, one arm reaching toward the wire as if he'd been trying to steady himself, his hat on the ground 3 feet away where the wind had taken it. His face was calm, almost puzzled, the expression of a man who'd been surprised by something he probably should have seen coming. The doctor in Amarillo later said it had been fast. A massive coronary infarction, the kind that gives you maybe 10 seconds to understand what's happening before it takes you completely. Clara walked back to the house. She did not run. Later, she would not be able to explain why she didn't run, except that some news is too large to carry quickly. She found her mother at the kitchen table writing out feed store figures in the spiral notebook she used for accounts. "Mama," she said. Eileen looked up. She saw her daughter's face. She closed the notebook carefully, set down the pen, and stood. They buried Harold Miller in the Nazarene Cemetery east of Hereford on a Thursday afternoon in February, the sky heavy with clouds that couldn't quite commit to snow. 40-some people came, neighbors, the men from the co-op, 2 of Harold's Korean War Veterans Association friends who'd driven up from Lubbock, the minister from the Methodist church they attended intermittently, and a handful of townspeople who showed up at funerals as a form of civic obligation. Eileen stood at the graveside in her good black dress and a coat that was too thin for the weather, holding Clara's hand, and she did not cry, not because she wasn't grieving. The grief was enormous, a physical thing, a weight across her chest that made it hard to draw a full breath. But because she was already calculating. She was calculating because she had no choice but to calculate. She had $411 in the household account and $63 in the savings. She had a note on the farm of $9,000 and change. She had a wheat crop in the ground that would come up then, if it came up at all, and she had no hired man because the two young men who'd been helping Harold had both taken oil field jobs in Odessa and Midland since Christmas, where the pay was better and nobody asked you to fix fence in February. She had a daughter in college, a tractor that needed the carburetor rebuilt, and no idea how to operate the combine that sat in the equipment shed, which Harold had always run himself. She was 49 years old. She had never been anything but a farmer's wife. She did not consider that a limitation. She considered it a profession. The spring was hard. She planted the summer fallow herself. Learning the tractor by reading the operator's manual and by making mistakes and by asking Chester Brower next section over, who was 70 years old and patient enough to show her twice what he'd shown Harold 100 times. She baled hay. She learned to operate the water pump. She fixed a windmill brake herself with the help of a telephone call to the implement dealer in Amarillo, who walked her through it step by step, apparently astonished that she was asking. The wheat came up exactly as Harold had feared. Thin, uneven, the yield per acre running 40% below average. Wheat prices dropped that summer. They dropped because everyone's wheat in the panhandle was competing for the same elevator space, and because the market was soft, and because that is simply what prices do to farmers. They drop at the worst possible moment, as reliably as the law of physics. In August, she made her note payment late. In September, she didn't make it at all. She drove into Amarillo in October and sat across a desk from a man named Gerald Potts at First National, who was 34 years old and wore a necktie with a pattern of small diamonds and looked at her with the expression of someone who wished he were somewhere else. He explained the bank's position. She explained hers. He was sympathetic in the way that people are sympathetic when they've been trained to appear sympathetic while delivering news that won't change. The bank had a procedure. The procedure required that when payments lapsed beyond 90 days, the property had to go to foreclosure. He was sorry. He truly was. But she drove home in the dark, the headlights of the 52 Ford cutting into the flat black of the panhandle night, the radio on a country station out of Amarillo playing Webb Pierce. And she did not cry then either. She did something more difficult. She called Clara, who drove home from Amarillo that weekend, and she told her daughter everything. Every number, every figure, the whole plain arithmetic of their situation. And she said, "I wanted you to know the whole of it." Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. She was wearing Harold's old canvas jacket, the one he'd worn for fence work, which he'd been wearing since February, the way some people keep wearing a thing that smells like someone they've lost. "Then we'll find a way," Clara said. "There isn't a way," Eileen said. "Not one I can see." "Then we'll wait for one to show up." The foreclosure notice came by certified mail in early spring of 1958. The auction was scheduled for the third Saturday of October. The third Saturday of October was cold, not the scouring existential cold of January, but the sharp, clear cold of the Texas Panhandle autumn morning, the kind that smells of dry grass and with smoke and makes the distant grain elevators stand up crisp and silver on the horizon. The sky was the pale wash blue of old denim, and the sun was there, but contributed very little warmth, and every breath made a small cloud. By 8 in the morning, the road along the section line to the Miller farm was lined with trucks, F-100 Fords and Dodge Power wagons, and a few older models from the early 50s, their beds carrying fence posts and hay bales and tool chests that had nothing to do with today's business. Men had loaded their trucks out of habit, or to have something to do with their hands, or because they didn't want to arrive at a foreclosure looking like they'd come specifically for spectacle. They came in their good flannel shirts and their best boots, which is what men in that part of Texas wore to anything that required respect. There were perhaps 60 people gathered by the time Sam Pruitt climbed up on the flatbed truck that had been pulled to the center of the yard for the purpose. Sam was a county auctioneer, a heavy-set man of 50 with a red face and a particular vocal instrument required for his profession. Not the rapid-fire machine gun delivery of cattle auctioneers, but deliberate, carrying baritone built for real property, for land, for weight. He had a microphone connected to a battery-powered amplifier that kept cutting in and out, and he tapped it twice, making the sound boom across the yard and send a pair of sparrows off the barn roof. Gerald Potts from First National stood at the edge of the flatbed with a manila folder under his arm, wearing his diamond pattern tie under an overcoat that was slightly too big for him. He kept looking at his watch. A boy of about 12 was moving through the crowd with a red wagon, carrying a coffee urn and stacked paper cups. A hand-lettered card on the side read, "Coffee 5 cents. Proceeds to the Boy Scouts." He was doing brisk business. Eileen came down from the porch at 8:15. She walked slowly, not because she was reluctant, but because she walked with the measured pace of a woman who had decided that she would not be seen to hurry or flinch. She put on her good wool dress, the dark blue one she wore to church, and her winter coat, and she'd done her hair. Clara walked beside her, wearing Harold's canvas jacket over her dress, her dark hair pulled back, her face set with a particular expressionlessness of a young woman working very hard to hold everything in. They stopped near the windmill, 20 feet from the edge of the crowd. The windmill was barely turning in the light morning air. Harold had painted it the previous spring, had climbed the tower himself on a sunny April day and repainted the galvanized vanes, and Eileen had watched in the yard below, shading her eyes, calling up to him to be careful, and he called down that she worried too much, same as always. The paint was still good. The windmill still worked. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You want to go back inside?" Clara asked. "No," Eileen said. "This is our land. I'm going to stand on it." The Cadillac arrived at 8:30. It was a black 1957 sedan DeVille, the paint still carrying a shine that had no business being on a dirt section road, and it parked at an angle in the dry grass beyond the trucks, as if it didn't want to be associated with them. The man who got out wore a gray herringbone suit and a hat that was too nice for an outdoor auction, and he stood for a moment smoothing his lapels and scanning the assembled crowd with the casual, proprietorial ease of someone who has never been uncertain about the outcome of things. His name was Lawrence Dewey, and he was from Dallas, and he had bought 11 foreclosed farms in the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico in the previous 18 months. He bought them cheaply, always, because he had learned that the neighbors of foreclosed farmers maintain an informal code of non-interference at auctions, a gentleman's agreement, an old Plains custom. That meant that legitimate market competition often disappeared entirely, leaving only the dead amount and his low offer in the field together. He had calculated that the Miller farm would sell for between $6,000 and $7,000. The debt was $9,200. That meant the bank would take a loss on the principal, write it off, and Eileen Miller would receive nothing, not a cent, and would have to leave the land she'd lived on for 22 years with nothing but the contents of farmhouse and whatever government benefit Harold's service record might yield. He stood apart from the crowd, near his Cadillac, and he lit a cigarette and watched with mild patience as Sam Pruitt tested the amplifier again. There was something in the way the neighbors kept their backs slightly turned to him that he had noticed at other auctions. He had decided it was envy. At 8:45, a truck pulled off the county road and stopped in the dry bar ditch about 30 yards from the edge of the gathered crowd. It was an old truck, a late 40s GMC half-ton, dark green, with dust on the quarter panels and a cracked running board, and particular road-worn look of vehicle that had covered serious distance. The engine ran for a moment after the key was turned off, ticking and knocking before going quiet. The door opened and a man stepped out. He was about 40 years old, medium height, lean in the way of a man who'd been active all his life without thinking much about it. He wore jeans and boots and a heavy canvas shirt open at the collar, and a wide-brimmed cowboy hat that he'd pulled down against morning light. He leaned against the side of the truck, arms folded, and he looked at the crowd, at the flatbed truck with Sam Pruitt on it, at the barn, at the farmhouse. His face was relaxed. He was watching with the quiet attention of a man at a movie who hasn't decided yet what he thinks of the picture. Nobody recognized him. In that crowd, nobody would have expected to. Some of the men nearest him glanced over once, and then away. One or two might have thought there was something familiar about the jaw, the dark eyes, the ease of his posture, something they couldn't quite locate. But nobody from the North Amarillo farm country was expecting to see the face on the covers of Look magazine and the RCA Victor advertisements standing in a bar ditch off a county road at 8:45 on a cold October Saturday. And so nobody saw it. The mind doesn't see what it isn't looking for. He stayed where he was and watched. Sam Pruitt called for attention at 9 o'clock. The crowd gathered in a rough semicircle around the flatbed, men pulling their hat brims down against the low morning sun coming in from the east. The boy with the coffee wagon positioned himself at the edge of the crowd and sold his last 3 cups to men who were holding them more for warmth than thirst. "All right," Sam said into the microphone, his baritone carrying easily across the yard. "We all know why we're here, and I'm not going to dress it up. We're going to conduct this sale in accordance with county procedure, and I want it done proper." He cleared his throat. He was a man who would call hundreds of auctions, but he'd never fully lost the discomfort of the foreclosure ones. Something in his face showed it. The property auction is described as follows: 320 acres, Section 14 and Section 15, Potter County, Texas, including the farmhouse and all attached structures, the barn, equipment sheds, windmill, water tank, and related infrastructure, and all pertinent rights. The opening bid will reflect the outstanding debt against the property, which stands at $9,214 as of this morning. He paused. "I'll ask for opening bids." The silence that followed was one of the specific silences of the American plains, thick with things unsaid, with the particular honor of people who had already, without discussing it, made a collective decision. Not one of the 60 farmers and neighbors standing in that yard raised a hand. They looked at the ground. They looked at the sky. They sipped their coffee. Several men near the back, when they thought no one was looking, glanced at Eileen and Clara by the windmill with an expression that was part grief and part helplessness, and part the stubborn pride of people who would not be the instrument of a neighbor's ruin even when there was nothing they could do to prevent it. Lawrence Dewey watched this display of restraint with the expression of a man watching a hand of cards he'd already calculated. He waited 30 seconds, just long enough to seem reluctant, and then he raised one finger with the ease of a man gesturing for a second drink. 6,000, he said. His voice carried. He'd spoken at enough auctions to know how to project without appearing to project, a skill that is close kin to performance. The number went through the crowd like a cold wind. 6,000. $3,000 short of the debt. That meant the bank would take a loss. Write off the difference. Close the books, and Eileen Miller would stand on her husband's land for the last time with nothing in her hands but the legal notice of eviction and the memory of 22 years. $6,000 for 320 acres of Texas wheat ground, a barn, a windmill, the room where Harold Miller had died in February, the kitchen where Eileen had stood at the window watching him walk out to the fence line for the last time. Sam Pruitt looked at the bid with the expression of a man doing his duty despite all of his better instincts. "I have $6,000, he said. His voice was steady. "Do I have 6,000 once," he said. He paused. 6,000 twice. The voice came from the road. 11,000. The crowd turned, not gradually, not one by one, but all at once. 60 people swiveling toward the sound as if pulled by the same string. The stranger was walking forward from the bar ditch, unhurried, his boots finding the dry grass without looking down at it, his hat still pulled low. He crossed the 30 yards to the edge of the crowd, and the crowd opened without being asked, the way crowds do for a man who moves with absolute certainty. He stopped at the front and looked up at Sam Pruitt. Sam Pruitt looked back at him. Something passed across the auctioneer's face, a flicker of recognition, immediately suppressed, replaced by professional composure. He was not certain. He could not be certain. The man before him was unshaven, driving a dusty 30-year-old truck, wearing working clothes that had not been pressed. But the face. $11,000, Sam said carefully. "I have 11,000 from." He paused, waiting for a name. The stranger said nothing. He simply nodded once, confirming the bid. In the silence, Lawrence Dewey turned slowly and looked at the stranger for the first time with actual attention. He took a long pull on his cigarette. He recalculated. He had not come to an auction to be outbid. He had not been outbid in 11 purchases. He was a man who did not lose to drifters in bar ditches. 12,000, Dewey said, and there was an edge under the words now, something that hadn't been there before. 13, the stranger said. The word was immediate, almost before Dewey finished speaking, and the brevity of it. One syllable, no hesitation, told the assembled crowd something about the nature of this particular contest. This was not a man being cautious with money. This was a man who had arrived with a number in mind and was willing to reach it without drama. 14, Dewey said. 15, the stranger said. Dewey looked at him for a long moment. He was a businessman. He understood when a deal had turned, when the arithmetic had inverted, when the cost of winning had exceeded the value of the prize. The Miller farm at $15,000 in this market was no longer a profitable acquisition. It was a point of pride, and Lawrence Dewey was a careful enough man to know that points of pride cost money in ways that the ledger never captures. He dropped his cigarette and stepped on it. "I'm out," he said quietly, to no one in particular, and walked back toward his Cadillac. The silence that settled over the yard then was of a completely different quality from the earlier silence. It was not the silence of reluctance and grief. It was a silence of 60 people trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Sam Pruitt looked at the crowd. He looked at the stranger. He set his jaw and did his job. $15,000, he said. Going once, going twice. He brought down the gavel, a wooden handle he'd been carrying since 1947. Sold. The stranger walked to the flatbed truck the way he'd walked everything else. Without hurry, without performance, without anything that could be read as pride or display. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his canvas shirt and brought out a plain brown envelope. And from the envelope, he began to count bills. The bills were hundreds. He counted them carefully, one at a time, placing each one on the edge of the flatbed truck where Gerald Potts could see them clearly. And as the count climbed, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 75, 100, 120. The people nearest the truck began to move closer, quietly, as if drawn by gravity. $150 $100 bills. $15,000 in cash. In an envelope he'd been carrying in his shirt pocket, on a county road in the Texas Panhandle, on a Saturday morning in October. Gerald Potts counted it twice. He looked up at the stranger with an expression that contained several competing emotions, none of which he could have named easily. "That's correct," he said. "The property sells for $15,000. After the outstanding note of $9,214 and the auction fees and accrued interest, the remainder," he did the arithmetic quickly, "the remainder is approximately $4,600 and some dollars, to be paid to Mrs. Miller as the prior owner." The stranger nodded. Sam Pruitt had his deed book open. He had his pen. He looked at the buyer with his pen ready. "I'll need a name for the deed," he said. "Who do I make this out to?" The stranger had been about to turn away. He stopped. He looked at Sam Pruitt. He looked at the pen and the deed book. And then he looked, for the first time directly, across the yard to where Eileen Miller was standing by the windmill with her daughter Clara. He looked at them for a moment. Then he turned back to Sam Pruitt and said, quietly but distinctly enough that the people nearest him heard every word, and the words moved through the crowd in a wave of whispers. "Put it under Eileen Miller." Eileen had heard the bidding from the windmill. She had heard the first bids, and she had felt the bottom of her stomach drop when she heard the Dallas man 6,000, because she had calculated enough times to know what 6,000 meant for her future. She had gripped Clara's hand. Clara had gripped back. Then she had heard the voice from the road. She couldn't see the stranger clearly from where she stood. The crowd was between them, and her eyesight was not as sharp as it had been, and the morning sun was in her eyes. But she heard the number, 11,000. She heard the counter. She heard the bidding climb. She felt Clara's grip tighten on her hand with each number, each exchange, until the gavel came down at 15,000, and the yard went silent, and she was standing on her land, and she did not entirely understand what had just happened. Then Sam Pruitt was walking toward her with his deed book, and Gerald Potts was behind him, and the crowd was parting to let them through, and the deed book was in Sam Pruitt's hands, and the name on the deed was hers. She took the deed book and looked at it. Eileen Ruth Miller. Her name, the land description, the section numbers, 320 acres. Her hands began to shake, not from cold, though it was cold, not from weakness, from something that had no clean name, something that was grief and relief and gratitude tangled together so tightly they couldn't be separated, the way roots grow together underground. Clara put both arms around her from the side and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish the moment. The stranger had moved through the crowd toward the road. He was almost back to his truck when Eileen called out, "Sir." He stopped. She walked toward him, still holding the deed book against her chest. Clara walked beside her. The crowd stood back without being asked, creating a corridor of space. When she reached him, she looked up at his face. And even then, even this close, she could not have told you his name. She did not follow popular entertainments, did not buy Life magazine, had not seen a picture show since 1953. She saw only a man who was somewhat younger than she'd expected, with dark eyes that were patient and a little tired, and a face that was handsome in a way of men who have never thought about it. "I can never repay this," she said. He looked at her for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was easy and direct, the voice of a man who had considered his words in advance and found the simple one sufficient. "It isn't a loan," he said. She waited. "Your husband served," he said. "I saw the VFW post on the notice. Korean War, it said." He paused. "Men who serve that country paid something that doesn't show up in any ledger. This land." He glanced briefly at the farmhouse, the barn, the windmill. "Your husband already paid for this land, called overdue back pay." Eileen looked at him for a long time. "Harold would have argued with you about that," she finally said. The corner of his mouth moved. "That's all right. He'd have been wrong." She started to speak again, and he held up one hand, gentle but clear. "Keep farming," he said. "If it gets hard, ask the county extension office. That's what they're there for. And your daughter." He looked at Clara, who was watching it with her dark eyes wide and intent. "She can study, or she can farm, or she can do both. It's her choice. But make sure she knows it's her choice." Clara said quietly, "What's your name?" He smiled at her, a real smile, easy, briefly bright. "Take good care of this place," he said, and he turned toward his truck. Sam Pruitt said it. He'd been certain since the bidding. He'd held the certainty all through the counting, all through the deed writing. Turning it over in his mind the way you turn over a large and unexpected thing to make sure you've seen it right. Now the man was walking away, and Sam Pruitt was 60 years old and had grown up listening to radio programs and buying records and going to picture shows. And he knew a face when he'd been given long enough to see it. He said it loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "That's Dean Martin." The name went through the crowd like a match struck in a dark room. The man at the GMC truck paused with his hand on the door. He didn't turn around. There was a moment, 3 seconds, for what he only sounded was a windmill and the distant cawing of crows somewhere over the south field. Then, without turning, he lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in the brief, loose salute of a man who had been found out and accepts it gracefully. He opened the truck door and got in. The engine started on the second try. The truck backed out of the bar ditch, the cracked running board glinting in the October sun, and then it was on the road and moving, heading west and then southwest toward the Arizona line, growing smaller against the flat immensity of the Panhandle horizon until it was a dark speck and then a suggestion and then nothing at all. The crowd stood in the yard of the Miller farm and watched the road for a long time after the truck was gone. Eileen Miller went back into her house at noon. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, and she held the deed, still warm from her coat pocket, and she read the words on it several times. Not because she didn't believe them, because she needed the act of reading to make them real in the way that the mind requires a thing to be visited and revisited before it agrees to accept it as permanent. Clara made soup. She moved around the kitchen the way Harold had moved, purposefully, without wasted motion, the same way Eileen realized that she herself moved. You pass things down without knowing you're passing them. They ate together without talking much. Outside, 2 of the neighbor men, Chester Brower and his son-in-law Dave, were out in the yard looking at the tractor, and Dave had brought his tools in the bed of his truck. She hadn't asked them. They just stayed. That was the thing about the people in that county. They couldn't outbid a Dallas businessman, and they couldn't restore a dead man to his family, and they couldn't undo the arithmetic of a hard year, but they could stay. They could appear in the yard with tools. They could bring casseroles and not explain why. They could show up and do the thing that was in front of them to do. It was not nothing. It was, in the long run, most of what kept people going. In the spring of 1959, Chester Brower taught Eileen to run the combine. It took 3 attempts and one minor incident involving a fence corner, which she did not mention to anyone. By the 1960 harvest, she was running alone, from first light to dark, the way Harold had. The wheat was better in 59, and better again in 61. The prices recovered. The extension agent in Amarillo gave her information about a new drought-resistant variety that held up better in the thin rainfall years. She planted it in 62 and never went back. Clara finished 2 years of college in Amarillo, studying accounting, and then came home in 1960 because she wanted to. This was important. She had the choice. Her mother had made sure of it, had said it plainly every time it came up. "You don't have to come back." Clara had said, "I know, that's why I'm coming back." She married a man named Robert Taft in 1962, no relation to Senator, a fact he found endlessly irritating. He was a third-generation wheat farmer from the next county, over a quiet, competent man with large hands and the particular patience that farming requires of people who intend to stick with it. He moved on to the Miller place. Together he and Clara worked it and improved it slowly over the decades, adding a grain bin in the late 60s, upgrading the tractor in 1971, replanting the windbreak that Harold had always meant to replant. Eileen watched all of this from the kitchen window, most mornings holding her coffee with both hands. There is a quality of light in the Texas Panhandle in late October that is no equivalent anywhere else. A particular slant and clarity that comes when a harvest dust has settled and the sky has rinsed itself with a cold front and the sun is low enough to come in at an angle across the flat country, without any elevation to soften or complicate it. It falls on everything equally. The wheat stubble and the old barn wood, and the galvanized windmill and the gravel of the section road, and it makes everything look exactly like itself, without flattery or illusion. On October mornings in the decades after the auction, Eileen Miller sometimes stood on the porch in that light and thought about the man in the bar ditch. She had tried once to write him a letter. She'd gotten as far as a salutation, stared at the paper for a long time, and then folded it and put it away. What could she say that would be proportionate? What language existed for the thing he had done? She had considered writing simply, "We are still here. The land is paid for. Harold's daughter is farming it." But she didn't know where to send it, and she suspected that a man who left the way he left had reasons for not being easy to reach. She tried once in the late 60s to find out more about the details of that morning, had asked Sam Pruitt, who was still alive and still auctioneering, what he remembered. He said he remembered everything. He said the man had seemed entirely at ease, as if buying a widow's farm at a Texas Panhandle foreclosure auction were simply the next thing on his schedule, to be dispatched with the same light competence he brought to everything else. Pruitt said he'd asked around later, carefully, and learned only that Dean Martin had driven to the Panhandle in October 1958 on a personal trip. No tour dates, no appearances, no publicist. He had, as far as Sam could discover, not told anyone what he'd done. He never mentioned it in any interview. Eileen died in September of 1981. She was 72 years old, and she died in the farmhouse, in the bedroom she'd shared with Harold for 22 years, with Clara beside her and Robert in the doorway. She did not suffer at the end, the doctor said. She simply stopped at the memorial service. In the Methodist church she'd attended with Harold, the minister said the expected things about faith and labor and the mercy of God. In the front row, Clara held her oldest daughter's hand, a girl of 15 named Ellen, who had her grandmother's eyes. After the service, walking back to the farm in the cold September afternoon, Clara went into the parlor and stood before the thing on the wall. The original deed was framed in a simple wood frame that Harold's brother had made. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still clear. Eileen Ruth Miller, Section 14 and Section 15. 320 acres. The date, October 1958. Clara stood before it for a long time. She was 53 years old. She had lived most of her life on this land. She had driven her father's tractor and bled her knuckles on the windmill brake and watched the wheat come up in the spring 1,000 mornings, thin and then thickening, the pale green of possibility thickening to the deep gold of the thing that had survived. She had been 20 years old on the morning of the auction, wearing her father's canvas jacket, because it still smelled like him, standing beside her mother by the windmill, watching everything that had come to the edge of being lost. And then a man in a bar ditch had said $11,000. She touched the frame lightly. She did not know, in any final sense, why he had done it. She had constructed explanations over the years. He'd known men like Harold. He'd owed something to the idea of service. He'd passed through enough hard country to understand what the land meant to people who lived on it. He'd had money that belonged, in some redistributive logic of grace, in the pocket of a woman trying to hold her dead husband's farm together with her bare hands. Maybe all of these, maybe none, but she had come to understand that the reason mattered less than the fact. The fact was the deed on the wall. The fact was the land outside the window, still in the family, still unencumbered, still producing, still holding the light of October mornings the same way it always had. The fact was her daughter Ellen, who was 15 years old and already asking to drive the combine, already looking at the fields with that particular narrowed assessment that farmers use when they're reading crop and weather. The chain held. That was the word for it. The word Eileen had used once, on a winter evening in the late 60s when Clara had asked her to explain how she'd managed to keep going the years after Harold died. Eileen had thought for a while and then said, "Every generation holds a chain for the next one. You don't have to hold it forever. You just have to hold it long enough to pass it on." She had held it. A stranger in a bar ditch had put the chain back in her hands when she was about to lose it. She had held it until she couldn't, and then Clara had taken it. And now Ellen was learning the weight of it, the way its links felt in the hands, the way it required constant grip, but also allowed you, if you paid attention, to stand up straight. The farm is still there. You can find it on the county maps. The same section number Sam Pruitt read from a flatbed truck on an October morning 60-some years ago. Section 14 and Section 15, Potter County, Texas, north of Amarillo. The farmhouse has been added on to twice, and the barn has been re-roofed, and the windmill replaced with a newer model. Though the original galvanized base is still there, still anchored in the same caliche ground where Harold Miller walked out to the fence line for the last time. The deed hangs in the parlor, not a copy, the original, in the same simple wood frame. The paper yellowed now to the color of old wheat straw. Eileen Ruth Miller. The date, the section numbers. In the lower right corner, where the buyer's name is ordinarily recorded, there's a line that has always puzzled people who look at the deed closely. The line where the buyer would have signed his blank. The man who bought the farm and gave it away in the same moment left no signature, as if he understood that the permanence of the gesture did not require a name attached to it. The family has never sold it, has never mortgaged it, has held the chain. And on October mornings, when the light comes in at that particular angle across the flat country and falls on the wheat stubble and the old barn wood and makes everything look exactly like itself, on those mornings, the land holds all of it quietly in a way that land holds things, without comment, without sentiment, without anything so small as forgetting. It just holds. For all the men who came home from the cold places and never said what it cost them, and for all the women who held the farms while they were gone and held them after,